Hello all, congratulations on reaching the end of the Hasmonean period. Sort of. There's actually one more Hasmonean king, but we'll get into that briefly when we cover the reign of King Herod. I have a lot to talk about today, but before getting into that, I just want to say thanks to the big wave of new subscribers that have come in over the course of this series. I know many of you found this channel through Anubis. I imagine a lot of you didn't really know what to expect, but I hope you're happy with what you found. I also know that some people might be apprehensive about becoming a patron on Patreon just for that commitment. So you can just send tips from PayPal. You can send any amount you want, and that'll be that. I will, if you want, even do vector art. If you send like $20 with a photo you want me to use and your contact info, I'll send it right over when I'm done with it. So on the cover art for this episode, I put the seal of the Hasmonean dynasty, which is a depiction of two cornucopiae and a pomegranate. I bring this up because sometimes in this series I use this seal to symbolize Judea as a whole, but sometimes I use this symbol of the menorah with either the words Medinat Yehuda HaChoshit, which means Free State of Judea, or Mamlechet Yehuda, which means the Kingdom of Judea. I started out this series using the menorah just as a generic symbol that people would recognize as Jewish, but it isn't actually authentic to the period. Flags, as we would think of them, did not really exist until the late medieval period, mainly as a way for ships to identify each other, and except for a few places like Rome, being a republic, the national symbol at this time would have been synonymous with that of the royal family, whether it's the eagle for Ptolemaic Egypt, or in this case the pomegranate and cornucopiae. So eventually I became more comfortable with the Hasmonean symbol standing in for Judea in those situations. So, this was the start of my videos getting much longer, and I'm used to that now, but even at over 11 minutes, there were things I couldn't fit into this video. And one of the big things is that John Hyrcanus presided over a lot of big building projects in Jerusalem. So Hyrcanus I commissioned 3 big projects in Jerusalem. First was the Hasmonean Palace, which he actually never lived in, even when it was finished. He preferred to continue living inside the barrack, and before that they actually lived inside the temple complex. To connect the temple to the Hasmonean Palace, he probably built Wilson's Arch. It's sort of the northern end of the Kotel Plaza today. The Acra, which was the fortress built on top of the city of David, was also converted into a kind of embassy row, or these palaces of the upper aristocracy. But probably the most noticeable addition on the map is this aqueduct, which carried water into Jerusalem from miles and miles away, even further south in Bethlehem, from a complex of reservoirs called Solomon's Pools, which were themselves fed by reservoirs from even further away, and ran right along the scarp of Mount Zion, under the pavement of Wilson's Arch, and into the temple complex, and that replaced the Siloam Pool and the Gihon Spring as the main water source. And finally, a correction on the map. The Gaza Strip at this time would have been called Paralia, or Paralia, which leads nicely into. So one thing I didn't get into with this video is that the monarch, as head of the military, had unilateral power to appoint military governors to Judea's provinces. What provinces? We aren't actually sure, because these were not provinces the way we think of them today. They were strictly military, and so it varied over time how many provinces there were and where. So this is a map of Judea's provinces based on their description in Josephus's The Jewish War. Obviously that's much later than the Hasmonean period. It's also a time when the Jewish army was much bigger than it had ever been during the Hasmonean period. But the basic 4 regions, these 4 provinces, the Galilee, Samaria, Perea, and Judea, not to be confused with the kingdom as a whole. These were the main provinces. Sometimes they were divided into smaller divisions called toparchies, but we don't know as much about them. One thing the monarch could also do was appoint aediles, for which read the people in charge of running cities like mayors, but not elected. This itself, like so much of the Judean government at this time, seems to have been directly inspired by the Roman Republic, except that Roman aediles were expected to personally finance celebrations in their cities. Judean aediles actually do appear to have had a salary, and so probably administered public funds, and this will become relevant in the Herodian period. But for our purposes, it doesn't matter, because and this will become relevant in the next series on the Herodian dynasty, Jewish titles of nobility were recognized in Rome. So I, for example, am a parash, a descendant of the royal cavalry of Judea. And if the Roman Republic still existed and I visited Rome today, I would be treated as an equite, which is a second-class citizen. So even if aediles were a little different in Judea, they would still be accorded the same honor as their Roman equivalents. Another thing I wanted to go into more depth about was the rules regarding priests. So the rules regarding priests and their also hereditary assistants, the Levites, come from the biblical book of Leviticus. And even as we talk about Jewish priests in the past tense, Kohanim still live by these rules. I have a cousin who is a Kohen, his father is a Kohen, and he would be expected at the very least to marry a native-born, non-convert Jew, even in a Reform synagogue. But because this is a history show and not a theology show, I don't want to get too deep into the particulars of this kind of practice without revealing my own ignorance. So if you want to explore this in action, I would very much recommend a book called The Year of Living Biblically by A.J. Jacobs. What he does in that book, which is to live for a whole year according to a literal interpretation of the Bible, isn't something that anyone in Judaism does or is supposed to do, but it does go into these kinds of rules and how they are interpreted, which is very interesting. Before talking about the content of this episode, I want to say two things. Rest in peace, Kirk Douglas, and a very special thanks to my friend Julia for posing for the thumbnail art. This was the first time I didn't just trace a public domain image, but since starting this series, I had always intended to have her be the model for Queen Alexandra. So that said, Alexandra, or Shlomtzion as she's known in Hebrew, if she was so influential, why isn't she better remembered? And there's no one definitive reason, but there are a few contributing factors. One of them is just timing. She arrived too late to make it into the Bible, and she arrived too early to make it into the Talmud. But also there's the issue that public expressions of support for the Hasmonean dynasty were suppressed under King Herod, which we'll talk about in the next series. There's a hypothesis that the Book of Judith, which is part of the Deuterocanon, is an allegory for Alexandra, but if it is, the allegory is so subtle that it may as well be a total fiction. So if you're a person who watches a lot of videos about ancient history on YouTube, as I am, you may have been surprised that I described Pompey's Judean campaign less negatively than most people who discuss it. And this is something that I encountered repeatedly, not just in YouTube videos, but in all manner of sources. One account I read alleged that Antipater had sent his legion to help Caesar in Egypt because he hated Pompey. It's stuff like that. The most common idea I came across, though, was that Pompey's intervention in Judea set the stage for all the future bad relations between the Jews and Romans, and in my experience, the people making these assertions aren't Jewish. And I think I know why. I think people have difficulty conceptualizing just how much time passed between Pompey's intervention and the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 CE. That's over a century, almost a century and a half. In that time, Judea's fortunes rose and fell repeatedly, relations with Rome strengthened and weakened repeatedly, and I think it's important to keep in mind just the amount of time in between these events, and not to draw a direct connection between them any more than we would between events happening today and like the 1880s. My main source for this series was Flavius Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, which describes Pompey's intervention in basically the same tone that I did. He was someone who was alive during the Herodian period, and it would not have been in his frame of mind to retroactively point to the Hasmonean Civil War as a setup for his own life because it happened 100 years before he was born. Honestly, there's a lot more detail I could go into that I had to leave out with these videos, but I'm gonna leave it at that because the time has come to start doing the voiceover and artwork for the Herodian period. So as always, like, share, subscribe, become a patron on Patreon, or leave a tip if you can. Special thanks to my Gaonete level patron Vicky Nelson, and I will see you next time.